Good day to our retailers and leaders from all industries, including our allied industries. This is Raf Layosa, founder and CEO of Retail Gate Technologies, your program partner and the Chief Technology Officer of the United Neon Media Group. And welcome to PRA's Let's Talk Retail. Now, I'm pretty sure there are a lot of leaders and managers out there that are wanting to know how they can effectively fulfill their duties in their respective companies and industries. And oftentimes, many of them experience an overlapping function while they try to carry out their responsibilities. But don't worry, guys, because luckily our guest today will help us identify the difference between leadership and management, the traits each function needs to possess, or rather to help achieve the goal of their respective companies. Now, how can leaders effectively and efficiently coexist, and how can they really lead by example? So we will really look into the difference between leadership and management, the traits each one needs to possess, and how can we achieve our goals in leading our teams and ultimately our companies to be leading in the industry. Now, before we head on to our conversation, we would like to thank our premium platinum sponsor, Globe Business and Vasava Consultancy, as well as our sponsor who is also our sponsor for their unwavering support for PRA's initiatives. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and click the bell button to be notified first. So without further ado, I am very pleased to introduce to you our guest for this episode of Let's Talk Retail. He is a speaker, author, strategic advisor, and business and leadership growth coach to CEOs and executive teams worldwide. He is the author of 2 books, Activators, a CEO's Guide to Clearer Thinking and Getting Things Done, and Creating a Culture of Accountability. Now, and he's also an active contributor to Simon Sinek's online learning platform and a featured speaker with the Growth Faculty, Australia's premier live leadership learning event firm, a core advisor to Gravitas Impact Premium Coaches, and a mentor to coaches worldwide. He also speaks of how clarity of purpose makes day-to-day, hour-to-hour, and moment-to-moment choices easier and better. We'll learn more about that in this episode. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome on screen, Mark Green. Hi, Mark.
Hello there, Raf. Great to be with you. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast today.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Let's Talk Retail, Mark. And I'm really excited to learn more about leadership from you right there. And let's just take that one bit you really spoke of. I actually saw that post of yours on LinkedIn about clarity of purpose makes day-to-day, hour-to-hour, and moment-to-moment choices easier and better. What does that mean to the leader when we speak to the leaders listening or watching our podcast now?
For sure. Well, your purpose is the why. It's why you're pursuing something. It's why something's important to you. It's what gets you out of bed in the morning. It's sort of this primal motivating factor. And what I have found is that when I or the leaders I coach have a very, very clear purpose, a very clear sense of why what I'm trying to pursue matters to me, okay, some bigger sense of what it's all about, it becomes easier day to day, hour to hour, moment to moment to make some of the trade-off decisions that we need to make to stay focused where we need to focus. It also makes it easier to keep going when the going inevitably gets tough. And and that's the thing is if you look at the analysis of what makes successful people successful, it's fundamentally that they do the things that less successful people won't do. And that is making certain decisions or taking certain risks or working harder or continuing to press through adversity or on and on and on and on. And this idea of being purposeful is a very powerful idea for leaders as individuals to achieve their own objectives, but then organizationally as well, to be able to bring people with you, which is indeed one of the primary functions of a leader.
That is very true. And I love how you really mentioned that it really starts from a place of clarity. And you also spoke of how it has to be purposeful, or the mantra of leaders is really, it starts from intentionality. We got to be intentional with every act, every decision that we make, right? But let's speak to those that not necessarily are find themselves starting from that position. You know, it could be natural for founders or business owners, right? But let's look at the other side of the picture right here. How about those leaders who started from uh, going through the ranks, really worked their way through the ranks, really with that discipline, with that momentum building, moving forward. But then they suddenly realize, oh, they have a team now that they have to lead, right? So how do you then, what would you say to that kind of leader that found himself from that position of doing tasks very consistently towards becoming now having to lead and taking a bigger role with a bigger picture? How do you build that sense of purpose, clarity, and intentionality?
Yeah. Well, so what you just put your hand on is one of the primary obstacles that prevents leaders and organizations from being able to create scale. And it's this idea of a skills gap, because the leader that you're talking about, if you think about it, we all start our careers as an individual contributor. We're doing the work, right?
Yes.
And then over time, if we're really good, we become super workers, okay? Because we become the top workers, right?
Yeah.
And then if we get lucky, or if we catch the right break, or we've earned our way to it, we take our super workers and we make them supervisors. Okay. The problem is there's a huge difference. If I wake up tomorrow as a supervisor, but I woke up this morning as a super worker, there's a lot of things that are no longer the same there, because it's no longer about me, right? And that supervisory role is the first role where this transition occurs that then, as you said, kind of continues on through additional levels of leadership over time, right? And so the obstacle is that my success as a worker and a super worker is based on my technical skills, my ability to get the work done, okay?
That's right.
My success as a supervisor or a leader is based on my soft skills, on my people skills, not on my ability to get the work done, because I have people to get the work done now. And the challenge for leaders is to realize that that's a transition, and to be able to make that transition. And where we get stuck is when we keep being the super worker while we're also the supervisor, okay? And this shows up in surprising ways all the time. I had a conversation today with a client of mine, who's a multinational CEO in the marketing space. And sure enough, he's doing some work for one of his managers that he shouldn't be doing. Now, his intentions are great. And it turns out this manager isn't the right person. And that's why he feels compelled to do the work. But it was the ability to pull back and help him see this in a different light that caused him to say, got it. So I'm being the super worker now when I should be the CEO. And what I really should be doing is fix my manager problem, which is what I call a right person, right seat problem. I got the wrong person in the seat. Okay. Let me just bring this around to purpose now for you. And so if you take this person who's come up through the ranks, this idea of purpose doesn't necessarily have to be earth-shattering, world-changing, kind of an idea. It just needs to supply some context to your team. And context is why. It's the understanding of why. And so, look, we need to produce 1,000 widgets a day. So go do it, right? Well, but why? Are you helping your people understand the why behind the widgets, or why behind why do the widgets need to be of a certain level of quality? Or, in the retail sector, the why behind my expectation of you to approach every single customer with a smile and ask if there's something particular they're looking for today that I might be able to help you with, right? And so instead of saying just do that, give them the context, and you start to open the window a little bit to purpose, because when you get the context, okay, the next question I would ask is, okay, but why does that matter?
That's right.
Okay. And then you get more context. And then I would ask again, okay, well, why does that matter?
And keep
and you're going to get somebody to really think deeply at that point. They'll think, wow, like, and they'll come up with an answer. Why does that matter? And if you ask this question 3 or 4 times, you finally cut down to the bone, and you get the essence of why something really matters. And a hint is, it's never the first 3 answers. The first 3 answers are always the easy answers, the comfort zone answers, right? Well, you have to approach every customer because customer satisfaction is important to our firm. Okay, but why does that matter? Right? And you'll get a deeper answer, like, well, without customer satisfaction, we're not going to have repeat customers, and it's not going to allow us to grow the way we want to grow. Okay, well, why is that important? Right? And you may end up coming up with some answer like, it's important because we employ 200, 25,000 people, and our vendor network extends around the globe. And if we don't greet all our customers the right way, it puts all of those people's earnings and personal economies at risk. And that's why it really matters. No. And maybe, and again, I'm just suggesting that's a possible path to an answer, right? But you don't have to have some giant earth-moving thing in mind, as much as just follow the train of why does that matter? Why does that matter? Why does that matter? Why does it matter? To come up with an answer that provides a deep and meaningful context to your team.
Now, when we think about that, you're finding that or providing that deep and meaningful context, then how do we bring it from a place of why it matters to the company to why it matters to the very individual himself?
Yeah. And this is the zone where I would turn it into a question to the person or the people who I'm trying to help make that connection and understand. And if the purpose of our company is this thing, whatever that is, okay, I would just ask, how do you feel that's relevant to you? And I would let them answer the question. And you'll get people who will just say, oh, I have no clue. I have no idea. And then you can prompt them and say, okay, well, what about this? Or what about that? Or what about that? But you'll be surprised that many people can answer that question. They'll think about it and they will answer the question, and they will create their own meaning, which is way more powerful than me having to create the meaning for them.
That's true. And that actually brings me back to one note you mentioned earlier, that when you're transitioning from being a super worker to the supervisor, essentially the picture changes from, it's no longer about me, it's about the people I'm working with. But and I love that, because that's actually, in a way, it can be missed by some people going through that transition wherein there's that big trap wherein, oh, I'm already the supervisor, now it's about me, you have to follow me, right? But how can leaders that are affecting those transitions for their people as they're breeding leaders within, manage that paradigm shift, or really make that paradigm shift in their people from really happen effectively, from being a super worker to a supervisor, and really see it as it's not about them, it's about the people that they will be leading? How can leaders do that?
A little humility, Raf, goes a long way. And I think it's very important for a leader to lead by example, and to be humble, and to be seen as being humble, and to recognize and reward humility. I think it's understated, and I think we don't develop that enough in people. For example, in North America here, our culture is very individualistic and very driven around individual performance and superstars and all of that. And you get a lot of people who come up through the ranks with a chip on their shoulder, and they do think it's about them. And those are the people who turn into leaders whose team hates them, or, have high turnover on their team because people don't want to stay and work for a jerk, which really is what that is. And it's not necessarily their fault, because the leader is behaving the way that they were incented to behave all through their career. They were actually rewarded for that. And so you can't point a finger and say, well, it's your fault. You should be more humble. Well, I mean, yes, they should be more humble. It's not their fault how they got there, but it is their fault that once they know about it, if they're aware of it, that they should be able to do something about it. And this is a real challenge, right? But that's the thing I would say, is to lead by example, and help build humility across the team. It also makes for much more effective teams.
I love that. And I take it that's why in one of your posts, you also actually said here, all eyes and ears are on you as the leader. Your own integrity and accountability is the model for your team. Maybe let's dig right into that, right? And when we think of that, then for the leader, it's easy to lose sight of that. I mean, if it's something that's been normal in the business, or let's say there's a change in leadership. No matter what model or structure in the business or in the company might be, there might be a change in leadership, and then the leader now realizes that maybe, or how can the leader be mindful of that and make sure that they do not end up being a bad model or the wrong model for their people? What are the telltale signs that the leaders should be mindful of?
So it's interesting. I like the quote that you read. I mean, I wrote it, but I love that quote. And I say it all the time. All eyes are on you, whether you realize it or not, all the time as a leader. And, leaders don't realize that their whisper is the equivalent of a shout in an organization. They don't realize that their speculation is taken as gospel and fact. They don't realize that their criticism or questioning something is taken as a death sentence. They don't realize that their guarded optimism is taken as a victory lap. And everything is amplified. Okay. And it just makes it so important that we're mindful of that, and that we do, in fact, lead by example, and just be careful what you say and what you do, because the organization takes its cues from you. And, you will, without realizing it, create the norms and create the culture, either by accident, if not by design, by accident. And that's usually the way it happens. And it usually doesn't work out so well.
Now, when we think of leading by example, you touched on the importance of humility, right? And and we've also heard countless times already that with that humility, especially in leadership and even with dealing with customers, there has to be that right level of empathy. So what does empathy look like from a leadership perspective?
Well, this gets to the transition from technical skills to people skills, and why it's so important, because empathy falls very squarely in that soft skill zone, which I would say they're not soft, they're actually quite hard, but we call them soft skills, the people skill realm. And it's this idea that you want to always be sensitive to the other perspective. And like I get on my clients quite often to improve how they communicate with their people and with their companies. And the piece that's most often missing is context. And in fact, I write about this in the issue of my newsletter that's going to be published tomorrow, as a matter of fact. And, context really, really matters. But we leave the context out because there's a bias of information, which is this sort of unconscious belief that we have the same information, even though we don't. And so from the communicator standpoint, I may omit something that I take for granted, but that my listener doesn't understand. And that's a real problem, especially with leaders, and especially when you introduce a power gradient, meaning that the communicator has more power than the listener, because then the listener is less likely to say, hey, Raf, wait a minute. What you just said doesn't make sense. Can you please clarify what you mean by this? Right? That's something that's you got to have a pretty special culture for somebody to be saying that to a leader, especially a senior leader in the organization. And that's the power gradient that kind of amplifies all of this. So as a leader, you really have to have empathy and be deliberate about that in terms of thinking through, what's the message that I'm trying to impart to my team or to this person? And what's their point of reference right now? And how do I meet them where they are so that I can grab their hand, sort of metaphorically grab their hand and walk them across a bridge with me to the place where we share the same information. And if you think about that idea that I'm over here on this side of a chasm, they're over here on this side of a chasm, and I want them with me, I can't just like yank them over. I have to walk across the chasm myself, grab them by the hand, and then walk them back. And what's required for me to do that in terms of having to understand their situation, in terms of having to communicate to them context or content, and actually bring them with me to where I am. And this is very hard for people to really understand and work through, because I've yet to meet a CEO who says, yeah, I'm a really bad communicator. They all think they're great. They all think they're great. Well, guess what? They're not. They're not. There are all kinds of biases and things at play here, psychological things at play, that really make us way less effective as communicators than we think we are. And it's one of the, if the primary function of leadership is to create change and bring people with you, then the function of communication is the mechanism by which you can do that. It's critical. And it's just an area that I think is really where we underperform as leaders. And there's huge opportunities. And you just need to be deliberate about it and really kind of think through what am I trying to accomplish? Where's this person, or where are these people now? And how do I get them over here with me with the same information? And just that series of questions is enough to open up at least some improvements to what would have happened without having asked.
I love that. And on that note of being deliberate, right? And actually that really brings us to your point actually about how a lack of communication or miscommunication is really the bottom line of the problems in business, right? Now, when we think of being deliberate, then what are the practical things that leaders can do to intentionally and deliberately disrupt the way they communicate, so they can actually diagnose if there are problems that that they might be overlooking, and how can they actually fix those problems in their communication?
I have my clients, particularly my CEO clients, monitor what I call their question to statement ratio. And what it is if you can imagine, over the course of a day as a CEO, Raf, you make statements to people, right? Because you're telling people to do things, right? And you're also probably asking questions. And what if you kept track of that for a few days and tallied up how many questions did I ask today versus how many statements did I make today when I was in front of other people, okay? In front of people I lead. And what we find is that the question to statement ratio is way off kilter. We've got leaders who make a lot more statements than they ask questions.
Yes.
And that's a problem, because what you're doing essentially is diminishing. It's back to being the super worker. You're diminishing the value of your people. It's like the one brain with 1,000 arms, right? To run your business that way, as opposed to a business with 1,000 brains and 1,000 arms. Seems a lot better to me. Like as an investor, it makes a little more sense, right?
Definitely.
And so that's something to be mindful of, is this question to statement ratio. And so the shift here is to be asking more and saying less. Okay. Another rule of thumb is the 80-20 rule, which is in any interaction, whether you're in a meeting with a group of people and you're a leader, or in a one-on-one, you should be asking questions 20% of the time and listening 80% of the time.
I love that. I mean, I was about to ask you about that. What's the right ratio there? And you answered it right off there. 80-20, 80% of the time you have to be listening, and only 20% of the time that we're really talking.
And it's hard. It's hard
it is
for a lot of leaders I know to just shut up. Right? And like zip it. Or how do you ask a question and then stop talking? And this is a real challenge for people. You know,
That's
and
right.
you have to learn as a leader also to be comfortable with silence. It's interesting because I went through this in my evolution as a coach. It was very uncomfortable for me to be in a silent space with somebody, to give them room to think and to respond. But when I was able to start doing that and be in silence with someone, the quality of the interaction skyrocketed, because inevitably they would just need the time to process what I had asked, and they would then come back with a response. Whereas in the past, my discomfort caused me to jump back in, to feel like I had to do more, right? And I think a lot of leaders suffer that same ailment as I did, and you can certainly grow past it. But you need to understand that, you know, questions were designed to be answered. Therefore, if you ask a question, you must stop speaking.
Yes, let them speak, right? And actually, from my own experience, I really seen the power of two words. Actually, it's "you decide." Can you tell us more about that? What's the real power that can create, right? Or the impact that can create for the organization when the leader says those two words, "you decide"?
Yeah. So there's been a lot of research done around what creates motivation in a workforce. And the three big areas are purpose, autonomy, and mastery. Right? So we've already talked about purpose, having the sense of I'm a part of something bigger than myself, right? Autonomy is my ability to make my own choices that yield my own results. And I need to be willing to live or die by that. But the idea of having autonomy is inherently motivating to people, as opposed to having no autonomy. You must do it this way, exactly this way, every time. Like, right? That's the opposite of autonomy. And then mastery. And mastery is this idea that I can be learning and improving at something. And I am growing and becoming the master of something, of some domain or knowledge area or task or thing. Okay. And those are the three elements there. And so your question, which again was, you tell me, or it was you decide, or
You decide.
You decide. Yeah. Your question, you decide, is a question that to me invokes autonomy. Okay. But it may also call on mastery, and it might also be guided by purpose. And so it's a powerful question. Another very powerful question is, what do you think?
That's right.
Okay. A more powerful question than that is, what do you recommend?
Yes.
Because that's taking the think one step further into synthesizing an actual recommendation or potential solution. And this is we're just kind of opening up here the power of the right question to create engagement. But I want your audience to understand that it's purpose, autonomy, and mastery are the big three. And that's the reason why, the mechanism by which these questions are so effective at creating engagement and creating higher performing organizations And frankly, organizations where your highest performers are going to want to stay with you and continue to contribute, as opposed to what often happens in the wrong environment, where you lose the highest performers because they won't tolerate not being well led.
That's right. Yeah.
You know?
And I love that, yeah, because I think it really comes from that place, from the leader, of recognizing our own strengths, right? As a leader, you got to recognize your own strengths and also your own limitations. You can't be the one doing everything, right? You got to surround yourself with experts and empower them, let them do that, right? And what does that mean then, from in terms of results then? What have you seen has become the results of leaders actually, or CEOs even, really taking away the hat of being the chief everything officer and start delegating and really trusting? Because relationships run by the speed of trust, right? So what does that what's the output from that then?
So I'd like you to imagine a picture of a treadmill and a CEO who's holding on to everything, sprinting at high speed on that treadmill. Yeah. Okay. And oh, by the way, their hair is on fire while they're sprinting on the treadmill. Their hair is on fire. They're running as hard as they can. They're exhausted all the time. And yet, because it's a treadmill, the view never changes. The view never changes. That's the starting point that you're suggesting, just so I can amplify this for your listeners to understand. And so the contrast there is that I'm now in a place where I feel like I'm driving a bus filled with capable people who are actually contributing the resources to keep the bus moving in the direction that I have established. And that's exciting. And that's how it feels. That's the difference in what it feels like. And so what I've gotten from leaders is feedback like, I have so much more energy now. I have more time for my family now. I can't even tell you how happy I am. In fact, I can't even believe a year ago I was as off the rails as I was. And it's a huge difference in my life. And then, of course, we see it in the performance of the business as well, in terms of hard results. And that happens too.
That's right. I mean, and it really is liberating in a certain degree, right? I mean, you finally learn to entrust key things to key leaders within your organization. Now, I'd like to go back to that picture you just painted of running on that treadmill while holding on to a lot of things, and your hair is on fire. That pretty much sounds like the picture of every business since the pandemic hit. And you did note some 4 hard leadership lessons from the pandemic, especially in 2021. And I'd love to touch on that too. We already touched on the third one you mentioned about letting go and delegating more. But I'm very curious about the first thing that you cited here, which is big change is easier than little changes. I mean, wow, that's very new compared to what we normally think about. We've heard from Jim Collins saying we should fire bullets before firing cannonballs. But what do you mean then by saying big change is easier than little changes?
Yeah. So just to be clear, I'm a huge Jim Collins fan, and I do subscribe 100% to the idea of firing bullets before firing cannonballs. That's not change. That's experimentation before making a large commitment of resources. Just to be clear, so I don't want to confuse the two analogies or concepts. The change that I'm talking about is a change in policy, or if your business isn't quite performing right, the tendency is to nibble at the edges of what needs to be done. And so, for example, if you need to reduce your staff or limit your vendors or do some things to hunker down through a very challenging time, it is easier to make big change once.
That's right.
Than it is to make a lot of little change along the way. And if you think of the way that most leaders approach things like that, it's the little along the way. And the reason is we want to be optimistic. We think it'll be okay. And we also become very emotionally entangled with the people and the relationships in the business. And frankly, it causes less than optimal decision-making, especially if the preservation of the organization is on the line. And so that's where that concept comes from. If it's okay, I would like to broaden this question out a little bit and talk about 3 guiding principles that I've spoken about a lot over the last couple of years to help leaders and entrepreneurs guide their way through the pandemic. And there's 3 guiding principles that I share. The first is agility.
Yes.
You have to remain agile, and you have to be in a position where you can respond quickly to things. And we saw that very early in the pandemic. Okay.
Yeah.
And we saw the businesses that had advantage were at the time were the ones who moved fast. And I'll give you some perspective on that. I have a client of mine that's a New York-based firm in the financial sector. They were 100% in office. They didn't do any remote work whatsoever. And in a period of 48 hours, with 1,000 employees, they went to 100% remote. And the business didn't skip a beat. That's agility.
Yeah.
That's agility. Okay. Now, that's the second principle, though, is just as important as agility in terms of how my client was able to do that. And some people listening might think it doesn't make sense, but I'll explain how it does. The second guiding principle is structure. Now, structure is something that a lot of entrepreneurs don't want. In fact, structure is what a lot of entrepreneurs are trying to escape when they're quitting their first job because it's too much structure. And I want to do it my way. And I want to be loose. And I want to be agile. And I want to be able to do it my way. And so we have this mental model where we feel like structure and agility cannot coexist. And so we make a choice, and we think as an entrepreneur, well, I'm going to be agile because I hated everything structure, right? Sound familiar? A lot of people you know, maybe somebody you know in the mirror too. Yeah, right.
Very much.
Yeah. So, but here's the thing. What we don't understand or think about is that structure, smart structure, enables agility.
Definitely.
And so my client that I just told you the story about, one of the partners in the business spoke to me a few months later and said, Mark, if not for the structure that you helped us put in place, there's no way we would have been able to do what we did in 48 hours. No way. He said, how we communicate as a company did not skip a beat because of the structure that was there. It didn't matter if we were in person or virtual, because we had the underlying structures that we could use. And I don't mean structure like overly structured or too much like, a draconian structure, but smart, intelligent, scalable structure. And that might have to do with how we communicate, how we meet, how we set priorities as a team, how we define roles, and on and on and on. And these are structural elements that create the ability to be more agile. So we've got agility and we've got structure as 2 of the 3. And the third, not surprisingly, in this pandemic we're in, but I believe always, is humanity. We've got to realize that everybody is a human being and that everybody is being affected in some way that we can or maybe can't understand. And you have to be open to that and willing to do that. Another one of my clients mid-pandemic said to me one day, Mark, I discovered the killer question for my staff. Killer question that just people talk about and get all excited about. And it's an unbelievable question. And I said, great, what's the question? And he said, the question is, what are you making for dinner tonight? Because if you think about it, in the middle of pandemic, when everybody was locked down, we didn't have a lot of control. We didn't have a lot of autonomy, right?
Yeah.
But what's one thing that we had autonomy over for sure is we could take whatever food we had in the house and choose to make something with it. And what he said is he would ask that question of people and they would just light up and tell him all about their dinner plan. And it was a really great recognition of the humanity of what was going on, of the situation. And I think a really powerful example of, just how taking the time to understand someone else's position is just this massive builder of relationship and trust and understanding and all good things. So those are the three guiding principles that I've spoken about quite a bit these past couple of years: agility, structure, and humanity.
I love that. I mean, I love how you really painted that picture very clearly, wherein structure is meant to enable agility, but you gotta bring it back home to humanity, because I mean, we're all humans in the first place. We should not lose sight of that, right? And when we think about that connection, then in relation to pursuing our goals, our vision, and our mission, right? And we think of of the asking the right questions to our team. Then, what would you say would be the important questions that we always have to ask our team members, coming from a leadership perspective?
So this is a really hard question because it can be very situational. I'm a big fan of how are you feeling right now?
Uh-huh.
Okay. Yeah. How are you feeling right now as a leader? How are you feeling right now as a member of my team?
Mm-hmm.
And how are your people feeling right now?
That is a very good check-in question. It's very important, actually.
Okay. Another one that I've been asking my leadership teams recently is, what's the top question in the last 60 days that your most junior staff are asking you?
Mm.
And it's fascinating because in formulating this question, the conclusion I came to is, and we see this in the patterns of the answers,
Yeah.
It will tell you the truth of what's going on in your company.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because the questions that leadership is getting from the most junior employees in the last 30 to 60 days will give you a clear glimpse of what is actually happening inside your company. And it's fascinating. And I've had teams, like, we've answered these questions as a team, looked at all the answers, and like you can see the patterns, and there's things that come up that have to be addressed that they wouldn't have seen any other way. So that's a really interesting question. And then, like I said before, what do you think? Or what do you recommend? Yes. Are really powerful questions, especially when a leader is in a skip level meeting. Mm-hmm. So do you understand that term, skip level? So if instead of work in a meeting with somebody who reports directly to you, you're in a meeting with someone who is one or two or more layers below you in the organization. That's right. And it's really powerful in a coffee chat or even a casual one-on-one with in a skip level situation for a leader to ask somebody's opinion or recommendation. It sends a really powerful message that you're important enough that I want to know how you think about this. And then to be the kind of leader that potentially acts on some of those things and then turns around and gives the credit back. We come all the way back to the conversation we had around humility. And what a powerful trait that is to enable that kind of behavior from a leader.
I love that. That is really powerful, right? To have that skip meeting and really get down to listen to what the people have to say and actually enact on that, and then bring it back to them that, oh, this is actually from you. This is because of your contribution. That makes it very real. I love that, Mark. Thanks for that. Yeah. Now, so as we are still all waiting through the pandemic, right? What would be your message? Speak to the leaders listening and watching us right now for this episode. What should leaders do now as we are really going through all these uncertainties? Like we've heard it said in left and right, we're really living in a hyper VUCA world where it's really volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. How then should our leaders respond in these times, in this kind of environment?
you need to have clarity on what's important. You need to have a sense of purpose first and foremost. And if you don't, figure it out. And if you can't figure it out, get somebody to help you figure it out. But figure it out, because that's a really, really important lever in your leadership arsenal. Then I would go to agility, structure, and humanity, as we discussed, which is making sure that you're putting the things in place to enable those three, particularly structure, because it's foundational. And, you know, if you're still in a position of not wanting structure because you want to be fast and loose, I would urge you to question that and really think about, you know, if that's really going to get you where you want to go. Right. And, you know, finally, I think it's important for you as a human being, as a leader, to make sure you're surrounded by the right people. We haven't had this part of the conversation yet today. But, you know, we become who we are primarily surrounded by, right? So this is why, for example, the super worker who's become a supervisor who doesn't get the idea of humility, it's not because it's who they worked for. It was who was around them that caused them to grow that way, right? You have the same values generally as your parents, as your family, because you spend a lot of time with them. Right. If you hang out with smart, curious people, odds are you're going to become more smart and curious over time. If you hang out with people who always look at the negative of things, or always question things, or are finding conspiracy theories everywhere, that's who you're going to become. And so it's really valuable for you as a leader to think about and actively question, who am I surrounded by? And to the point where you should be curating the right people, not just having it be by default. And one of the concepts that I wrote about in my first book, Activators, is this idea of changing your neighborhood. And it stemmed from a story, an interaction I had with my grandfather, who gave me real estate advice. And he said, Mark, whenever you buy your first house, don't ever buy the most expensive house in the neighborhood, because there's only one way that the other houses in the neighborhood can affect your property value over time. And that's pretty good real estate advice. It wasn't until years later, after my grandfather's death, that I realized one day that he wasn't giving me real estate advice, because professionally, I had become one of the most expensive houses in my neighborhood at that time. And I wasn't able to grow. And it was that moment, that flash of insight, thanks to my grandpa Ben's advice, his real estate advice, that caused me to make a significant change in my consulting practice at the time, which is actually the change that's led me to where I am today.
I love that.
You know,
I mean,
and so who you surround yourself with really, really, really matters. And in this kind of an environment, it's even more important than normal. So that would be my last point.
I love that. I mean, that actually reminds me of one thing I heard from Chris Hogan. He says, every leader needs to surround himself with a coach, a mentor, a friend, and a cheerleader. Just a little follow-up on that, Mark. Now, when you say we gotta make sure we surround ourselves with the right people, now, how do we filter it then and make sure that we really scrutinize and make sure we get the right people around us?
So my rule of thumb is this: if the people you're hanging around with professionally don't make you more than a little bit uncomfortable sometimes, or even often, they're probably the wrong people. You know, we're all in professional networks, or people are in mastermind groups or forums, right? Groups and forums and things. And the question is, are you the one who's helping most other people? Or do you walk into the meeting and think, oh, I hope they don't ask me about this, or you're having a conversation with somebody and you're thinking in your head, please don't go there, please don't go there, please don't go there, please don't, but you know they're going to go there in the conversation, and they're that kind of a person. That's the right person. You want to actually be surrounded by people that keep you off balance a little bit, that push you and challenge you. That's the reason for the mentor and the coach in the example you just gave from Chris Hogan. But it does it, and yes, of course, I'm a huge fan of mentors and coaches, but you got to look at the people you're hanging around with in general. And if they're not making you uncomfortable on a regular basis, that's a huge sign that you might be being held back without realizing it by well-intentioned, good, wonderful, nice people. But it's just that you may have outgrown them. And that you need something else if you want to continue the learning curve and continue to grow at the pace you're growing. And so the change your neighborhood exercise from activators, and there's a tool, actually a free tool on my website that your listeners can grab, and we'll get to that at the end, is actually to think of who are the 10 people on the planet who would be best positioned to help you get where you want to go in your business, in your organization. And then start to actually figure out how to get in touch with those people. Now that's changing your neighborhood, you know?
Definitely.
And it's really thinking very differently than the normal entrepreneurial, you know, like, well, you know, we hang out in packs, you know, like in really great organizations like EO or YPO or whatever. But even those forums can tend to be stale over time. And it's hard to escape is the problem. There's a lot of inertia and social inertia in those groups. And it can be really challenging to kind of say, hey, this isn't working for me anymore. I'd like to move on now, right? And it's hard to do that. But I think that that's a mistake for some people.
I love that. Thank you so much for that, Mark. Now, how can our listeners, our viewers, learn more about you, what you do, and even catch your books? You mentioned 2 books already. Where can we find more of you, Mark?
Absolutely. So Activators, A CEO's Guide to Clearer Thinking and Getting Things Done is on Amazon. It's also available on Kindle and on audiobook through Audible. And Creating a Culture of Accountability is on Amazon in soft copy only. And that book is a monograph. So it's a thin book on a single topic with a very practical angle to it. And that's by design. People can reach me at my website, which is mark-green.com. And I have free tools from Activators there. You can access the backlog of all my newsletter articles that I've published in the blog section. You can subscribe, which I would encourage. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn at Coach Mark Green. I post multiple times a week. I also publish my newsletter on LinkedIn. And I'm quite proud to say that I'm at about 125,000 subscribers, which makes me feel fantastic. And I am just embarking on a new offering that I'm calling the Coaching Gymnasium that I'm really, really excited about. And your listeners can learn more through LinkedIn and through my website in the coming weeks and months.
Awesome. And we're really excited for that. I'm sure our leaders that are listening or watching this episode would love to get their hands on that and to really continue to learn from you, Mark. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Let's Talk Retail. We've learned so much from you, and I'm sure we're all going to be much better leaders from what we've picked up from you in this episode. Thank you so much, Mark.
My pleasure, Raf. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Now, if you guys find this podcast interesting and want to learn more, we have a Let's Talk Retail playlist right in the channel, and you can stream all available videos from there. Now, we'll leave the link on the description box below so you can check right after this video. Now, don't forget, of course, to like and subscribe. Also, we would like to thank again our premium platinum sponsor, Globe Business, and Vasava Consultancy as our sponsor for making this episode possible. So there you have it. Again, this is Raf Layosa, founder and CEO of Retail Gate Technologies, your program partner, and the CTO of the United Neon Media Group. We'll catch you on the next episode of the PRA's Let's Talk Retail. Until then, let's continue to build meaningful relationships. See you then.